Okay, so this is the second part of the Datagrid walkthrough. What we're looking at here is how we create a user control. So, in the first part, what we created was just a simple form 1. We had our menu and we had our Datagrid view. This time, however, what we want to do is create a separate project, and the type of project that we're going to create is a class library. So in order to create a class library, you right click on your solution, you add new project, and then you select class library. And it's important that you select class library because the code that we're trying to create here is not an executable piece of code in the sense that you can't double click on it. We want to reference this code in some other executable program that we're creating. So what we're trying to do is create a user control which can be reused again and again in other Windows forms. And so our main Windows form here will be able to take advantage of existing code in our user control, and the class library allows that to happen. Otherwise we wouldn't be it wouldn't be as easy to embed a user control into your Datagrid view or into your form 1. So once we created our class library, we had to add in a new employee control. So we added in our new employee control, and it was a blank canvas, and then after that what we did was add in some of these labels. So we got our labels from our toolbox over here, we got these text boxes from our toolbox over on the left hand side, and then we just configured some of their names. So for example, right click on the first text box and go to properties, you'll see that its name has been set to txt_id, and likewise the first name has been set to txt_fname and surname and pay. So that was pretty much what we had to do for part 2. The thing to note about the user control is that it doesn't have any title bar, it doesn't have any minimize, maximize, X buttons to close it. It's just basically a plain canvas in which we build our kind of bespoke control on top of, and then what we're going to do is embed that within another Windows form. So you can't actually run an employee control as an application. It must be embedded within a Windows form in order for it to be usable. We built it also in such a way that we can use it in 3 different scenarios. One is the view employee, one is the edit employee, and one is the add employee. So what we've tried to do is build it generically enough so that we can use it in all 3 scenarios, but not too generic so that it becomes kind of almost bespoke to those situations. So going back to our Solution Explorer again, you'll notice that the employee control follows a fairly similar pattern to a Windows form. It's got a designer file and it's got a C# file and the ability to view the design view of the C# file, and also to be able to view the code behind that C# file. So again, like a Windows form, you'll see that the user control is a partial class, but unlike the Windows form, it inherits from the user control class as opposed to the form class. So here we have our partial class, employee control inherits from user control, and if we go back to our design code, you'll see that it too is a partial class employee control, and inside in that it defines such things as our IDs for the label and the text box, the first name, text box, the label associated with the first name, and so on and so forth. So the similarities are quite alike. So going back into our user control, what we want to have is that whichever developer takes our user control, they should be able to configure it to a certain extent. So when we want to use this in our view employee Windows form, we want to make sure that the data is not editable. Okay, so that the user can't go in and change any of this data. Then when the user wants to edit an employee, we want to make sure that the ID is not editable, but the first name, surname, and pay is. And then when a user wants to add an employee, we want to make sure that all controls, all text boxes are editable. So by default, all text boxes are editable. So we've already solved the scenario for the add employee. We now need to kind of concern ourselves with the edit employee and the view employee. And so in order to do that, we go back to the code behind file and we created two properties, one called edit only and one called read only, and they're both of type bool. So edit only, what's going to happen is that when someone uses our employee control, if they only want it to be editable, the employee to be editable, they'll set an edit only value to true, or if they want it read only, they'll set the read only value to true. Now just setting the properties to true doesn't make it work. We have to actually provide some code which checks those properties to determine what to do. So going back to our design view again, our user control design view, if you double click anywhere on the canvas but not any of the controls, so any of these gray areas here, if you double click on that you get the control load event. And what the control load event does is that once the constructor has been executed and it's performed its task, it raises an event to say I'm done and I'm ready for any other instructions you want me to do. So at this point what we're doing is we're taking advantage of the load event so that we know that our control has fully loaded up, and that our controls within our control is fully loaded up. And what we're going to do is that we're going to start turning on and off the ability to edit text within text boxes based on what the user has set the edit only or read only to be. So if it's edit only, then we want to turn off the ability to change the ID for the employee. So what we're going to do is txtid, so get a reference to the text box, use the enabled property which allows the user to either edit the text or not edit the text. So if enabled is set to true, that means they can edit the text. So what we're going to do is set the enabled to false, which means that it's effectively read only. You cannot edit that data. So we're just changing that for the ID text box. So that's edit only. We still want the user to be able to change the first name and the surname and the pay. Then for read only, what we need to do is disable all of the text boxes, and so that's what's happening here. So we're checking to see if it's edit only. If it's not edit only, then we're checking to see if it's read only, and if it is read only, then we're changing all of the text boxes to disabled. And that's it for part 2 of this exercise. So what we did was we created the user control project as a class library. We added in our employee control as a user control, and then we added our controls, the text boxes and the labels, and then we added two properties, read only and edit only, and then we just configured the load event to disable or enable the text boxes. So that's it for part 2. We'll move on to part 3 next.